Okay, so continuing with our discussion of Congress here, we're moving on now to questions of representation, okay? So going from the way that Congress is explained in the Federalist Papers, the way that the design and the reason that it's that way, and the way that the Federalist Papers explains the constitutional design and purpose and function of Congress. Going on now to representation, and when political scientists talk about legislative bodies, they tend to identify five major features, okay? The most obvious is legislation, right? They're writing legislation, they're writing laws. That's the first most basic thing that they do. And in democratic countries, of course, they are representing the people. So they're supposed to be writing the laws on behalf of the people, representing them in some way. Other functions, education, right? So if you've ever contacted a member of Congress, they probably wrote back, they probably explained to you why they're voting the way that they did on whatever you contacted them about. They make speeches, they do all kinds of things to help represent the people. Obviously, in a modern system like the United States, other parliamentary systems, other systems with checks and balances, they are checking the executive branch. And then the final thing that they're doing is legitimizing. If a bill is passed by a democratically elected legislature, obviously it has more legitimacy than if it's just, announced by fiat. And of course, you can kind of see that sometimes in countries that obviously don't have a very functional democracy. They still have a legislature. Even if the legislature has very little actual power, they're still trying to use that to justify or to give the actual rulers laws and actions and so on a certain legitimacy and a certain respectability, and making it look like there's a little bit more functional checks and balances, a little bit more representation for the people. Okay, so to this question, is Congress representative? How does Congress represent the people? Okay, and there are different ways you can think about it. One is descriptive representation, okay? Descriptive representation basically means, does Congress represent the people in terms of demographics? Okay, does the overall picture of Congress look like demographically what the population as a whole looks like? Okay, in terms of descriptive representation, no, Congress is not very representative. Okay, there are relatively few African Americans, relatively few Asian or Latino Americans. This is changing some, especially in the past 10 years, and of course, especially in the past 50 years. Far less than 50% of Congress are women, okay? Far less than 50% of the members of Congress are women. It's currently, this is as of, 2021, the 117th Congress. Okay, it's currently 142 members are women, okay? So that is roughly a third, and that is a record, okay? Just a few years ago, it was 25%, also a record. Maybe even more significant, women made up only got above the 5% threshold of composing either house, either the Senate or the House of Representatives. That only started in the 1990s, okay? Before the 1990s, there were just a very few women in each house, 5% or less, basically. So it is not descriptively representative in that way in terms of gender or race or ethnicity. Most members are also very wealthy, and they come from backgrounds in law, business, and so on. 96% of them have a college education. Okay, so they obviously do not represent the country as a whole in these demographic ways, in terms of how they look, in terms of their background, in terms of their wealth and education levels, all these things, okay? There's a notion of substantive representation, which is that even if a Congress member, a senator, a representative, whatever, does not descriptively represent a particular constituent or a body of constituents, they can still make laws that will benefit them or that will serve their interests in some way, okay? So, the fact that we don't have descriptive representation doesn't automatically mean that we don't have substantive representation. But it's obviously open to debate. There's no simple, cut and dried, objective answer to whether or not we do. But there are those two different types, okay? Descriptive representation and substantive representation. And of course, many people argue that you need at least some measure of descriptive representation in order to have substantive representation. You could think of counterexamples: wealthy white males who have passed, legislation that clearly benefited other groups. But those are two different types, two different ways to think about representation, okay? There are also three major theories, or sometimes called models, of representation, okay? What are members of Congress doing when they vote on these laws, okay? One theory or approach or one model is the delegate, okay? When a representative acts as a delegate, they are voting the way that their constituents would, the way that their voters back home in their home district or their home state, they are voting exactly as they would. They are there as a delegate, just carrying out the wishes of their voters or their constituents. As opposed to this, there is a trustee model. And the notion of the trustee model is that representatives, the public, their voters, their constituents, sort of grant them a certain trust to act in the way that is in the best interest of maybe the society as a whole. To some extent, when you start thinking of representatives as trustees, you can start to think of them as maybe looking at what's good for the country as a whole, rather than simply representing the wishes of their constituents. But it doesn't even have to go that far. Maybe they do not vote exactly the way that their constituents would want. But again, the notion is that a certain trust is granted them to use their judgment, to use their experience, to make the judgment, the votes, and so on, that they think are best. Okay, those two are sort of opposites, obviously. Either you're doing what your representatives want, or you're using your own judgment and maybe taking into account what your constituents, what your voters want, but ultimately using your own judgment, making your own decision. Then there's the Politico model, which kind of combines those two. Okay, the Politico model basically says that representatives vote as delegates on highly salient issues, on dramatic things that get a lot of attention and that tend to be very sort of hot button issues, emotional things that people care about. Okay, votes on wars or on gun control or on abortion, things that get a lot of attention and really mean a lot to people. People tend to have strong opinions about them. On those issues, they vote as delegates, and they vote the way that their constituents want, the way that their voters want. On all other issues, which in fact is the vast majority of legislation that goes through Congress, on these other issues, they vote as a trustee. And they use their own judgment, or maybe they just vote with their party. They maybe just defer to the judgment of their party leadership, okay? So that is the Politico model, okay? So you have these three models. One is the delegate model, says that members of Congress or representatives generally vote exactly the way that their constituents or their voters want them to. They are simply there carrying out the wishes of their voters. The trustee model says that maybe they take their voters' concerns and wishes into consideration, but ultimately they use their own judgment, and they do what they think is best. The Politico model says that on salient issues, on high-profile questions, pieces of legislation, votes that are going to get a lot of attention and people are going to feel strongly about, basically things that people are going to notice and that they may base their future votes on in the next election, they vote as delegates. On all the other issues, they vote as trustees. They use their own judgment, or again, maybe they simply vote with their party, okay? So the Politico is basically a combination of delegate and trustee, and it says when the issue is salient, when it gets a lot of attention, when people care about it, they vote as a delegate. All the other times they vote as a trustee, using their own judgment, or again, maybe just deferring to whatever the party wants. Personal ideology, again, tends to be decisive in most cases. For the most part, especially on relatively obscure subjects, doesn't mean that they're unimportant. It just means that they're maybe a little bit obscure right now, okay? The personal ideology, or again, maybe the just cooperation with the party tends to win out. So basically, in practice, what we really get is the Politico model, okay? What most representatives, what most members of Congress are doing most of the time is acting as politicos on those few questions and subjects and bills and votes that get a lot of attention and that their constituents or voters are really going to notice and care about. They vote as a delegate. The rest of the time they are voting as a trustee.